Imagine an ancient time when, after the death of a brother, there were mysterious rules about how his closest brother should behave towards the deceased's wife. Their rules were not just about what was right or wrong, but profoundly shaped people's lives and futures. Intriguingly, amid these enigmatic traditions, we discover the stories of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. A journey full of challenges and important decisions linked to these ancient practices and the unusual ones that these rules allowed. How Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz faced these expectations. Come and discover the answers in today's video. If you are interested in this type of content, don't hesitate to leave a like to comment. We will release the video during the jury period, which extends approximately between the conquest of the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy in Israel with the anointing of Saul. The situation in Israel was marked by great instability and many challenges. This period is often described as an era of anarchy and decentralization, characterized by the absence of strong central leadership and a repetitive cycle of apostasy, oppression, and liberation. The judges were charismatic leaders chosen by God to govern and save Israel in times of crisis. These leaders were not kings with centralized power, but rather figures who emerged to meet urgent and specific needs. Each of them led a tribe or group of tribes at a given time of crisis, often in the face of oppression. Due to foreign enemies or internal disorganization, the social and economic situation of Israel at this time was marked by great volatility. Life was hard and unstable, and the land, although promised by God, did not guarantee continued prosperity. The tribes often faced internal and external conflicts without a central monarchy to unify the tribes. Cooperation between them was limited and social cohesion was weak. The cycle of infidelity to God followed by oppression and, ultimately, divine intervention through a judge was a constant feature of this period. The agricultural economy of Israel was also vulnerable to natural disasters, the basis of subsistence for the majority of the population and one of the worst possible consequences of devastation. At the same time, there is no shortage of food, but it is also a reflection of the economic conditions, and the difficulty of maintaining a life is real and secure because it is not yet difficult in the context in which a relative of Judah decided to go to Moab with his wife Naomi and my sons, Mahlon and Chilion. A family in Israel has become so hard-pressed that life is unbearable for a family. In the country of Moab, a country that lives on the Jordan River, faith in a desperate attempt to escape hardship and find the living conditions in Moab, never before part of Israel and often viewed with suspicion and hostility towards Israelis, offered an opportunity to survive. In times of crisis, we will explore further the biblical story that vividly illustrates the application of the story of Leviah and our contemporary costumes of the story of Tamar and Judas. Of the family language and the history of Israeli society according to the biblical account in the book of Genesis. Moab comes from a tragic episode in the life of Lot, who fled the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah with his daughters. After this destruction, Lot and his daughters took refuge in a cave in the mountains. Lot's daughters, fearing that the humanity was extinct, they ensured the continuity of their father's lineage. They got Lot drunk and, in a situation of incest, each had a son with him. The eldest son was called Moab, and it turns out that the ancestor of the Moabites' name is the name of Moab, and it is a reference to the idea of the descent of my father. Genesis 19:36-38. As we pass through the time of Moab, since we have already identified it, and we have a notable presence in the region of Moab that is known to us as follows. Fortified cities and a possible mountain offer advantages in defense against invaders, and the decision to settle for foreign territory is not a trivial matter and is a small risk that is not involved in the physical separation from their homeland and heritage, but also an affirmation of the religious and cultural practices that define the country of Israel. The Moab are particularly aware of their religion and practices considered contrary to the precept of encouragement to God followed by Israel. Thus, in part due to the fact that Moab reflects a situation of desperation that has the need to survive due to its cultural and religious aspects that are familiar to it. Ahimelech. At first, a life in Moab seemed to offer some break to the family of Ahimelech, who found refuge in a land that, unlike Israel, faith spared them from famine, but challenges were not long in arising. The history of the Ahimelech family in Moab was marked by a series of personal tragedies. Elimelech, the patriarch and provider of the family, began to face difficulties. Although the Bible does not detail the exact circumstances of his death, it is clear that his death is a devastating blow to Naomi and her children. This lost faith is deeply painful for Naomi, especially in a context in which she often faces great difficulties without the support of a husband. She now finds herself alone, having to provide for the needs of these two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, in a strange land. Naomi's life in Moab is hard, but it is hard when you have children and thousands of them. You have lost your children who have lost their children because Naomi is in a situation of great vulnerability and despair. She is not alive, but she is married, but she has a son to secure her future, and she is afraid of her heart, and her feelings of abandonment have become a daily reality for her to face these devastating times. Naomi has come to consider a retreat in Bethlehem not because of the recent emotional circumstances, but also because of the practical circumstances. The life of Bethlehem sent her homeland where she could offer opportunities and return to her original community of offerings. Naomi has the chance to rebuild a life and a man without incurring adversity, completely alone by her decision to decide. Naomi prepared herself for a life back and made a meaningful gesture with her beautiful daughters Orpah and Ruth in a heartfelt and painful conversation. Naomi explained to them how she intended, and the two gave loving and selfless advice, telling them that they were not obligated to follow her because their situation was uncertain and there was no guarantee that she would find a better life in Bethlehem. Naomi knew that upon returning to Bethlehem, life would be difficult, and that she could not promise them safety or a future. Naomi advised Orpah and Ruth to stay in Moab where they could rebuild their lives, find new husbands, and have better opportunities. She expressed the pain and helplessness she felt and tried to convince them to stay in Moab where they could be reunited. Her family of origin and hope to prosper. Naomi did so with a heavy heart, aware of the sacrifice that was being asked of them. Orpah, after a moment of reflection, decided to follow Naomi's advice and stay in Moab. She said goodbye to Naomi, leaving Naomi and Ruth to take the journey back to Bethlehem alone. Ruth, on the other hand, made a radical and profound decision. Her response to Naomi was one of the most moving moments in this story. Ruth firmly declared her decision not to separate from Naomi. She said, "Don't tell me no press let you go back away from you, because where you go I will go, and where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Ruth 1:16. Ruth's decision was marked by unwavering loyalty and a deep commitment to Naomi. She chose to accompany Naomi to Bethlehem, knowing that life there would be difficult and full of uncertainty. Ruth not only demonstrated personal devotion to Naomi, but she also made a significant religious decision by adopting the God of Israel as her own God. The return to Bethlehem marked the beginning of a new phase for Naomi and Ruth. With Ruth by her side, Naomi returned to her homeland, carrying with her the hope of a new beginning, even in the midst of adversity. When Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem, the reaction of the townspeople was surprised and grateful. They exclaimed, "Is it really Naomi's?" Naomi, upon hearing this, responded with a feeling of bitterness and disillusionment, reflecting on the losses and trials she had endured. She said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has filled me with bitterness." Ruth 12. The name Naomi means pleasant or sweet, while Mara means aim. This change of name symbolized the deep pain and suffering that Naomi had endured. This season, Naomi explained that she left Bethlehem full but returned empty, illustrating the extent to which her losses had marked her life. Ruth lived there, although she was a figure of great loyalty and devotion, and was seen as an outsider within the Israelite community, which added a layer of complexity to the situation. The story progresses with the barley harvest season, which begins shortly after the arrival of Naomi and Ruth. Ruth, with practical determination, decides to seek a means of subsistence for both of them and goes to the fields to glean the ears of grain left for the poor and strangers according to Israelite law in Ruth 22. Ruth speaks to Naomi by expressing to him her desire to go to the fields. "Let me go and glean ears in the fields in search of the one who will favor me." Ruth's decision to work in the fields reflects her determination and her quest for survival in a new furrow of land. She begins to glean in the fields of Boaz, a wealthy landowner. He notices that Boaz has shown her great kindness. He not only allows her to glean in his field, but also instructs his servants to treat her well and leave more heirs for her. Boaz expresses his admiration for Ruth's devotion and loyalty to Naomi and praises her character. This is illustrated in Ruth 2:12. Boaz answered her, "They have told me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth to come to a people you did not know before. The Lord will repay you for what you have done, and may your reward be in full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth returned home and told Naomi about her experience and her encounter with Boaz. Naomi immediately recognized that Boaz was a close relative and therefore a possible redeemer according to the laws of Levirah and Rasha. The law of Levirah is a practice mentioned in the Bible, specifically in the book of Deuteronomy, that aimed to ensure the continuity of the lineage of a man who died without leaving a male heir. According to Deuteronomy 25 verse 5 to 10, if a man died without children, his closest brother would have to marry the widow to provide an heir who would carry the name of the deceased. These heirs would not be considered as the biological son of the new spouse, but as the son of the deceased, thus ensuring that the property and permanent inheritance would cease to belong to the family. This practice had profound social and economic implications and helped to maintain the family property within the clan, protecting the widow and her future children from misery. The purpose was to ensure that the name of the deceased would not be excluded from Israel and that his inheritance would be preserved in case the deceased's brother refused to comply with the law. Of Levirah, the widow had the right to present the case of the old city if she persists and does not reject the possibility of practicing a simplistic description consisting of tiring sand and spitting on the ground in front of the elders. This was considered a sign of contempt and series of man, known as man with the bare sandal. Deuteronomy 259 refuses to accept her death without prejudice to her life, but without prejudice to her reputation and the status of her home in the community. In the context of her story of Ruth, Boaz can act as the redeemer of Ruth and Naomi, although he was not a brother or sister, but close to falsehood. She was a relative but distant, a second-rate redeemer who has the responsibility to assume the role of redeemer in the absence of the closest Levite. It is in this context that Naomi devised a plan for Ruth to approach the good ones in order to bring her to fulfill the role of redeemer. Naomi advised Ruth to prepare carefully for a night without celebration where the good ones would rest after the harvest. She told Ruth to approach the good ones during the night while she was ready to rest and lie down at their feet. This gesture symbolized a request for protection and protection. Asking for the role of redeemer that night, Ruth did exactly what Naomi had helped, and Boaz, upon waking, found Ruth at his feet. Boaz was surprised and discovered that Ruth's initiative had led him to listen to her proposal and expressed his desire to assume the role of redeemer, but he emphasized that there was a closer relative who had the first right to redeem the inheritance of the Elimelech family. Boaz promised to resolve the situation in accordance with the laws and tradition, and the next morning he went to the city gate to deal with this matter. Boaz met the closer relative and presented him with the responsibility of redeeming the property and marrying Ruth. This relative, realizing the complexity and the associated blow, respected this. He decided to renounce his words. Boaz accepted the role of redeemer as mentioned in Ruth 49 and 10. Boaz began to say his old words, and to everyone that he said and that he asked for Naomi, and that she lost to him and to Mahlon, and he had also taken Ruth, the Moabite, my wife, as a wife, in order to perpetuate the name of the deceased in his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased would not disappear among his brothers and the gates of your city. You are today witnesses of the role of the Redeemer. The story of Tamar and Judas is a story that is found in Genesis 38 and is an excellent example of the importance of the practice of Levirah for the preservation of the family language and its heritage in Israelite society. Tamar, one of the many original Canaanites, believed in the house of my father as the first child of Judas. This house is guaranteed future security in the family of Judas by R and is described in Genesis 38 6-7 as an evil house in the eyes of the Lord, and, because of his wickedness, God killed him. The Bible does not specify the exact nature of R's evil acts, but the fact that God punished him with death shows that his conduct was unacceptable after the death of Er. The practice of levirah enters into the joy of harmony with the cultural and legal standards of the time, and that a man died without having children, it was up to the brother to marry the widow to give birth to an heir who would perpetuate the name and lineage of the deceased. So Judas the father asked his second son Onan, who fulfilled these obligations. Young 388 describes Judas' instructions to Onan that he marry Tamar and father an heir for his brother. However, Onan decided to fulfill this obligation instead of allowing Tamar to live. A son child who would be considered heir to Onan took measures to prevent her from becoming pregnant, thus avoiding fully fulfill his responsibility to provide an heir for his brother. Genesis 3:89 explains that by doing so Onan was preventing the line from continuing, thus frustrating Levi's purpose. Onan's disobedience also led to his own death as a direct result of his refusal to conform to divine law and his family obligations. After Onan's death, Tamar found herself in an extremely difficult situation. Precarious, without a husband or son, and without clear means of guaranteeing her safety and her place in Judah's family. This situation created an urgent need to find a solution to preserve the heir lineage and do justice to Tamar, who found herself without protection and without a guaranteed future within Judah's family. The story then continues with a decisive turn where Judas must face his responsibilities and make the decision to guarantee Tamar the possibility of preserving her position and the continuity of the family line. Judas feared that not even fate would reach his third son, Chiah, postponed fulfilling his responsibility. In Genesis 38 verse 11, Judas sent Tamar back to her parents with the promise that she would be called back when Chiah was an adult. Although he had no intention of fulfilling this promise, this delay not only frustrated Tamar, but also left her in a vulnerable and unprotected position over time. Tamar realized that Judas had no intention of fulfilling his obligations. Finding herself in a desperate situation, she decided to take a radical step to ensure her survival and the continuity of her late husband's lineage. In Genesis 38 verse 13, Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute and strategically placed herself on the path that Judas frequently traveled. Judas, not recognizing Tamar, approached her and, not knowing who she really was, agreed to pay her for her services. Tamar asked for a guarantee, and Judas gave her his sow, his cord, and his staff as a pledge of future payment for this. Tamar became pregnant and later gave birth to 2 children, Peret and Zerah. Tamar's pregnancy was initially a cause for scandal, and when Judas learned that she was pregnant, he became furious and ordered Tamar to be burned for her alleged immorality. However, when Tamar revealed the objects that Judas had given her as collateral, thus proving that Judas was the father of the twins, the situation took an unexpected turn. In Genesis 38 verses 24 to 26, upon realizing that he was the father of the children and that Tamar had acted to preserve the family line, Judas was forced to correct his mistake. He publicly admitted that Tamar was more righteous than he was because she had acted to ensure that the lineage would not die. Judas admitted his own guilt and the need to protect the lineage that he himself had neglected. This story not only illustrates the complexity of family responsibilities at this time, but also highlights how the actions of individuals can lead to justice and redemption, despite adverse circumstances. Despite the injustice she faced, she managed to ensure the continuity of her husband's lineage and demonstrated courage and cunning. Judas learned an important lesson about responsibility and justice by correcting his mistake and recognizing the correctness of Tamar's action. The story of good and routines that illustrates the practice of levirah is strikingly reminiscent of that of Tamar and Judas in emphasizing how family traditions and lineage-preserving responsibilities played a crucial role in society. Just as Boaz, by marrying Ruth to ensure the continuity of the line of Elimelech and Mahlon, upheld levirah's standards with integrity and generosity, Tamar also took bold steps to ensure the continuity of her husband's line by disguising herself as a prostitute to seduce Judas. Tamar showed determination to obtain an heir to hire and thus preserve the family patrimony. These two stories show how in times of crisis and adversity, individuals committed themselves to fulfilling the responsibilities and traditions that shaped the society and faith of their time, ensuring the continuity of the lineage and the application of cultural and religious practices essential to the preservation of the family and spiritual heritage. We return to our main story. The Bible relates that the marriage of Ruth and Boaz was a moment of great joy and blessing. The Lord blessed their union, and Ruth gave birth to a son named Obed. The birth of Obed was a sign of restoration and hope. Naomi, who had returned to Bethlehem in bitterness, found joy in the presence of her granddaughter. Ruth 41:15 captures the joy and blessing of this moment. The women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you lacking today a redeemer. May his name be celebrated in Israel. This child will remain your life and will be the sustenance of your old age, because your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better for you than this son gave birth to you." Obed, son of Ruth and Boaz, later became the father of Jesse, who was himself the father of King David, thus placing Ruth in the direct lineage of King David and ultimately in the genealogy of Jesus Christ as recounted in the New Testament. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz not only restored the family lineage, but also integrated Ruth the Moabite into the redemptive story of Israel, thus demonstrating the power of faith, loyalty, and the divine plan. Boaz is a key figure in the genealogy of Israel, and his origins are described in several biblical passages that detail his lineage and family connections according to 1 Chronicles 10-11. Boaz was the son of Salmon and Rahab. Salmon, in turn, was the son of Nachon and grandson of Amminadab, an important figure in the story of Judas. Rahab, the wife of Salmon, has a particularly remarkable story. She was a woman of Jericho who helped the Israelite spies when they were sent to spy out the city prior to its conquest. Joshua 2. Rahab's role as a woman of faith and courage was rewarded when she and her family were saved from the destruction of Jericho and integrated into the people of Israel. This connection to Rahab is significant for several reasons. And so, in David's genealogy, it demonstrates the extent of grace and inclusion in God's plan. Rahab, an outsider and a woman with a complicated past, became an integral part of Israel's royal lineage. This shows that redemption and inclusion are central themes in the biblical narrative. The story of Ruth and Boaz has profound impact on both the Christian and Jewish faiths, revealing powerful messages about loyalty, faith, and the extent of God's grace. This account not only provides insight into the lives and challenges these historical figures faced, but also offers meaningful lessons that still resonate today. The story of Ruth and Boaz is a story of transformation and redemption that transcends cultural and social barriers for Jews. It is a reminder of the value of family loyalty and the importance of social justice laws, such as the Levite, which ensured the protection of the most vulnerable and the preservation of the family name and heritage. Ruth, a Moabite, by choosing to follow Naomi and embrace the God of Israel, demonstrates the inclusion of outsiders in the divine plan, an important theme in Judaism, emphasizing that faith and loyalty are valued more than ethnicity or social status. For Christians, the story of Ruth and Boaz is even richer in spiritual and theological significance, as the Redeemer prefigures the figure of Christ as the Redeemer of humanity. The practice of levira, where a close relative redeems the family property and lineage, is seen as an anticipation of the coming of Christ. The role in redeeming humanity from sin and in offering a new spiritual inheritance. The inclusion of Ruth in the lineage of David, and therefore in the genealogy of Jesus, underscores the message of the plan of salvation. Salvation is for all regardless of their origins or past. The story of Ruth and Boaz offers valuable lessons that can be applied to contemporary life on many levels. First, loyalty and commitment are essential to the salvation of all people. Ruth's example of how faith and dedication can overcome obstacles and difficulties. Ruth chose to follow Naomi and accept the God of Israel even when faced with the uncertainty and challenge of living in a foreign land. This decision illustrates the importance of remaining faithful and honest even in the most difficult situations. The more difficult the story becomes, the more important it becomes. Naomi and Ruth faced their adversities thanks to their mutual support and the help of good people who showed generosity and respected the laws of justice. This reminds us of the importance of supporting and protecting others, especially the most vulnerable, and of recognizing the dignity and value of each individual, regardless of their social status or origin. Finally, the role of the good as redeemer is a powerful metaphor for how we can seek redemption and offer help to others in a broader context. This can be seen as a call to act with mercy and justice in the quest to have a positive and restorative impact on the lives of those around us. If this story has inspired you and made you think about your own life and how you respond to God's call, don't let this pass you by. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue learning about these powerful biblical stories. After all, true wisdom lies in listening to and obeying the voice of the Lord. Thank you for following us. God bless you.